Looking back, I guess the signs were always there. It's easy to connect the dots when you're staring at the picture long after it's been completed. But in the middle of it? When you're living day to day, caught up in the rhythm of what you think is a solid marriage? It's like trying to see a crack in the wall when you've painted over it a dozen times. My wife, Jessica, and I had been married for 6 years. We met in college. She was the sharp, ambitious type, the kind of woman who turned heads without trying. I was drawn to her confidence, the way she spoke like she owned every room she walked into. We got married young, full of big dreams and bigger promises, the kind you think are bulletproof because you said them with tears in your eyes and a ring in your pocket. For a while, things were good. Normal. Routine, even. We had our arguments, sure, what couple doesn't? But nothing I thought we couldn't handle. Then about a year ago, Jessica started acting different. She became distant, emotionally checked out. She'd stay out late, claiming work deadlines or girls' nights with her new friend, Amanda. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, she deserved her own space, her own life outside of our marriage. That's healthy, right? But it wasn't just that. She became overly protective of her phone, never letting it out of her sight. She'd laugh at texts and quickly lock the screen when I glanced over. Conversations grew shorter, colder. She wasn't interested in sex anymore, brushing me off with excuses like being tired or stressed from work that I chalked it up to burnout, thinking maybe we'd hit a rough patch. Couples go through that, right? But deep down, there was this gnawing feeling I couldn't shake, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind that something was off. I just didn't know what. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind where nothing feels urgent, and life moves at a slower pace. Jessica had left early, claiming she was meeting Amanda for brunch. I didn't think much of it, just another weekend plan I wasn't part of, which had become normal lately. But as I was cleaning up around the house, I noticed she'd left her tablet on the kitchen counter. Unlocked. That I never intended to snoop. I genuinely believed in respecting privacy, even when things felt strained between us. But there it was, her tablet, screen glowing softly like it was daring me to look. Curiosity isn't always innocent. Sometimes, it's the beginning of the end. That I tapped the screen, and her messages popped up. Not texts, she was smarter than that. It was her email. I scrolled through, expecting nothing out of the ordinary, maybe boring work emails. But then I saw it. Subject: last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you. The sender? Amanda. My heart kicked in my chest like it was trying to break out. I clicked the message, hands shaking slightly. The email wasn't vague. It wasn't just emotional confessions or innocent closeness. It was explicit. Descriptions of things they'd done together, things Jessica never did with me anymore. Phrases like, "I can still feel your hands on me," and, "the way you kissed me, I've never felt that with anyone else." I couldn't breathe. It felt like someone had punched me in the gut. My wife, Jessica, was having an affair. But not with another man. With Amanda. It wasn't just sex either. The messages were filled with intimacy, inside jokes, and plans. Plans that didn't include me. Weekend getaways, secret meetups, moments she'd stolen from our marriage without hesitation. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the screen, scrolling through message after message, watching the timeline of my marriage unravel in bold text and attachments of photos I didn't want to see. Eventually, I closed the tablet. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't pretend I didn't know. I didn't sleep that night. I just laid there, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of our marriage like it was some movie I'd watched 1,000 times, only this time, I was seeing scenes I'd missed before. The late nights, the sudden coldness, the way she'd brush me off like I was just part of the furniture. By morning, I was exhausted, but the anger kept me awake. It wasn't the kind of rage that made you yell or break things. It was quieter, heavier. Like trying to breathe with a weight on your chest. Jessica came home around 10 a.m., wearing the same clothes she'd left in. She smelled different, like perfume she never wore around me. Her hair was a mess, but not the "I had a fun girls' night" kind of mess. It was the "I spent the night with someone" kind. She barely looked at me as she set her purse on the counter. "Hey," she said casually, like nothing was wrong. That I stared at her, waiting for the guilt to show on her face. But there was nothing. No hesitation. No shame. Just business as usual. "How was brunch?" I asked, my voice flat. She shrugged. "Good. Amanda and I just talked about work stuff, boring." That was it, the lie. Smooth. Effortless that I felt my heart pound in my ears. I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Did you talk about last night too?" I asked, my eyes locked on hers. She froze for a split second, just enough for me to see the flicker of panic before she covered it with a tight smile. "What do you mean?" I stood up, grabbed her tablet from the counter, and tossed it onto the table between us. The screen lit up, still on the last message I'd read. She didn't even reach for it, she just sighed, as if I was the one causing the problem. "So, you went through my stuff?" she snapped, crossing her arms. That I laughed, bitter and sharp. "That's your takeaway? That I went through your tablet?" She didn't answer. She just stared at me, her face hard, like I'd wronged her. "Jessica," I said, my voice shaking with frustration, "how long?" She rolled her eyes. "Does it matter?" "Yeah," I shot back. "It matters." She exhaled loudly, annoyed. "A few months. A few months." Like it was nothing. Like she was talking about a new hobby she'd picked up. "Why?" I asked, desperate for some kind of explanation that would make this make sense. She shrugged. "I don't know. It just happened." The same excuse people use when they forget to pick up milk on the way home. It just happened. That I stared at her, waiting for her to say something that would feel real. An apology. A tear. Anything, but there was nothing. "Finally," I said, "did you ever plan to tell me?" She hesitated, then said quietly, "No," and that was it. The final nail in the coffin. That I didn't yell. I didn't throw things. I just stood there, feeling the weight of every moment we'd shared collapse under the truth. That I grabbed my keys and left, because staying felt unbearable and leaving felt like the only thing I could control. That I didn't have a plan when I left the house. I just drove, not caring where the road took me. The streets blurred past, but my mind was sharp, replaying the confrontation with Jessica like a cruel movie on loop. Her cold shrug. The way she made it seem like I was the problem for finding out. No remorse. No apology. Just indifference. Eventually, I ended up at my best friend Mark's place. Mark and I had been friends since college, the kind of guy who didn't need a long explanation to know when something was wrong. I knocked, and when he opened the door and saw my face, he just stepped aside without asking a thing. That we sat in silence for a while. He handed me a beer, and I stared at it, feeling more hollow than thirsty. Finally, he broke the silence. "What happened?" I told him everything, finding the emails, confronting Jessica, the way she acted like none of it mattered. Saying the words out loud made it feel more real, like hearing my own story from someone else's mouth. Mark shook his head. "She's a piece of work, man." That was the nicest way to put it. The next few days were a blur. I crashed on Mark's couch, trying to process everything. The house we'd built together, the memories we'd made, they all felt like a bad joke now. I kept checking my phone out of habit, expecting Jessica to call or text. She didn't, and that's when it hit me. She wasn't sorry, she didn't regret it. She just regretted getting caught. Eventually, I had to go back to the house. Duke, our golden retriever, was still there, and as much as I wanted to avoid Jessica, I couldn't leave my dog behind. Walking through the front door felt like stepping into a stranger's home. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt familiar. Jessica was there, sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone like she didn't just rip our life apart. She looked up, completely unfazed. "Oh. You're back." I didn't respond. I went straight to the bedroom, grabbed a bag, and started packing. She followed me, leaning against the doorframe, her arms crossed like this was some casual disagreement. So, what? You're just leaving? I stopped packing and looked at her. What do you expect me to do, Jessica? Pretend like none of this happened? She shrugged. It's not like I planned for it to happen. I just felt something with Amanda that I didn't feel with you. Her words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were true, but because they were so easy for her to say. Like our years together meant nothing. Like I was the placeholder, and Amanda was the upgrade that I didn't say anything else. What was the point? I grabbed Duke's leash, packed what I could, and left. No dramatic exit. No final words, just the door closing behind me, shutting out the life I thought I had. After leaving the house with Duke, I drove aimlessly again, just like the first time. The streets felt like a maze I couldn't escape, filled with echoes of a life that wasn't real anymore. Every street corner, every coffee shop we used to go to, even the grocery store felt like it held a memory of us, the us that I thought existed. But none of it mattered now. It was just noise that I finally pulled into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions, and that's exactly what I needed. Duke jumped onto the lumpy bed as if it was an adventure. I envied him. His world hadn't changed. He didn't know our family had imploded. He just knew I was there, and that was enough for him, but for me, nothing was enough. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my bag. It felt surreal, how quickly everything unraveled. One day, you're planning vacations and talking about the future, the next, you're in a motel room with your dog, wondering how you missed all the signs that I didn't cry. I wanted to, but the tears wouldn't come. Maybe because I wasn't sad, not yet. I was just numb. The next morning, I called Mark. His voice was a lifeline. Dude, come stay here. You don't need to be in some crappy motel. I hesitated. I didn't want to be a burden. But the thought of another night alone in that room felt unbearable. So I packed up Duke, left the key at the front desk without a word, and drove to Mark's place. When I walked in, he didn't say anything. Just handed me a coffee and sat down across from me. That bad, huh? He finally said. I nodded. Worse. Over the next few days, I crashed on his couch. Duke settled in like it was home, which helped. Mark didn't push me to talk, and I appreciated that. But eventually, the words spilled out. I don't get it, I said one night, staring at the ceiling. Why didn't she just tell me she wasn't happy? Mark shrugged. Because people like her don't want to feel like the bad guy. They'd rather lie until they can't anymore. That hit me harder than anything Jessica had said. Because it was true. She never had the guts to be honest. She just let me believe in a marriage that didn't exist anymore. A few days later, I decided to go back to the house. Not to see Jessica, I didn't care about her anymore. But I needed to get my stuff. My life was still there, packed into drawers and closets like nothing had changed. When I walked in, she was there, sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. She looked up, completely unfazed. Oh. You're back. I ignored her, heading straight to the bedroom. I started packing, clothes, books, anything that felt like mine. She followed me, leaning against the doorframe with that same smug look. You're really leaving? She asked, like she couldn't believe it that I didn't respond. She kept talking, like she needed to fill the silence. You know, it wasn't just about Amanda. I felt invisible with you. Like we were just going through the motions. I stopped packing, turned to her, and for the first time in days, I felt something sharp and real. Invisible? I repeated. You were the center of my world, Jessica. Every decision I made was for us. I supported your career, your dreams, even when it meant putting mine on hold. You weren't invisible. You were everything. She didn't respond. Just stood there, arms crossed, her face blank, and that's when I realized, I wasn't talking to the woman I married. She was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. So I kept packing. When I left, I didn't look back, because there was nothing left to see. After leaving the house for the last time, I didn't feel the dramatic wave of relief I'd expected. There was no cinematic sense of closure, no triumphant moment where I felt free. Just an ache, a hollow space where my life used to be. I moved into a small apartment downtown. It was nothing special, one bedroom, cheap blinds, and walls so thin I could hear my neighbors arguing about what to watch on Netflix. But it was mine, and that mattered. No shared memories tucked into the corners. No reminders of her. Just blank walls, waiting to be filled with something new. The first night there was the hardest. Duke paced around like he was confused, sniffing every corner as if Jessica might be hiding somewhere. I sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes I didn't have the energy to unpack, and stared at the silence. It was deafening. I tried to distract myself, Netflix, music, scrolling through my phone, but everything felt pointless. My mind kept replaying the same scenes, Jessica's cold indifference, the emails, her words echoing in my head. I felt invisible with you. Invisible. I thought about all the times I'd been there, her birthday surprises, the late-night talks, supporting her through job changes, even the way I'd remember her coffee order without asking. And somehow, none of that mattered. That's the thing about betrayal. It's not just the cheating. It's the realization that while you were fighting for something, the other person had already left the battlefield. The days blurred together after that. I'd wake up, go to work, come home, walk Duke, repeat. But inside, I felt like a shell, just moving through the motions. Friends reached out, asking if I wanted to grab drinks or hang out. I said no every time. What was the point? What could I possibly say? Hey, did I mention my wife cheated on me with her best friend? Yeah, good times. But then one night, Mark showed up unannounced, six-pack in hand. You're not going to rot in this apartment, man, he said, pushing his way inside. We sat on the floor, drinking cheap beer, Duke sprawled between us. Mark didn't ask how I was. He didn't have to. I think he knew that sometimes, the worst part of heartbreak isn't talking about it, it's not talking about it. Sitting with the silence until it drowns you. After a while, he said, you know it's not your fault, right? I stared at the floor, tracing patterns in the cheap rug. She said she felt invisible. I mumbled. Mark scoffed. Yeah, well, that's on her. Not you. I wanted to believe him. But the thing about betrayal is, even when you know it's not your fault, it still feels like it is. After he left, I sat there for a long time, thinking about everything. The life I'd built. The life I'd lost. And the life I hadn't figured out yet. That I didn't have answers. I didn't have closure. But for the first time in weeks, I realized something simple. I was still here, heartbroken, sure, but here, and maybe that was enough. For now, the days after Mark's visit were different, not better, just different. His words stuck with me. You know it's not your fault, right? I wanted to believe that. I really did. But betrayal doesn't just hurt you, it rewrites the way you see yourself. It plants these little seeds of doubt in the cracks of your confidence, and they grow like weeds, choking out everything you thought you knew. I kept replaying our life in my head, searching for answers in the spaces between memories. Did I miss something? Was there a moment where I could have changed the outcome? But the truth is, you can't fix something if you're the only one trying. And I was the only one trying. One Saturday morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun was just peeking through the blinds, casting thin stripes of light across the room. Duke was curled up at the foot of the bed, his steady breathing the only sound in the apartment. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. Then I made a decision that I needed to face it. Not just the memory of Jessica's betrayal, but her, in person. I couldn't carry this around like some invisible backpack filled with rocks, pretending it wasn't there. So I sent her a message. Short. Simple. I need to talk. In person. She replied within minutes. Okay. When and where? We agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown. Neutral ground. Somewhere public, where I couldn't fall apart, or at least, where I'd be forced to keep it together. The hours leading up to it felt like walking toward a cliff, knowing you're going to jump but hoping you'll find wings on the way down. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting by the window with her usual iced coffee, scrolling through her phone like nothing had changed. She looked the same sharp features, same confident posture, but something was different. Maybe it was me. Maybe I was finally seeing her without the lens of love blurring the edges. She looked up and gave me a half-smile. "Hey." I sat down across from her, my hands resting on the table, steady despite the storm inside. "Thanks for meeting me," I said, even though part of me hated being polite. She nodded. "Of course. Of course." Like this was some casual catch-up between old friends that I didn't waste time. "Why?" She sighed, leaning back in her chair, like I was asking something exhausting. "I don't know, Ryan. It just happened. It just happened." The same lazy excuse people use when they spill coffee on their shirt. "You loved her?" I asked, my voice quieter than I expected. She hesitated, then nodded. "I think I did. Maybe I still do." The words hit me, but not like before. It was more like a distant echo than a fresh wound. "Then why stay with me? Why not just leave?" She shrugged. "Because I wasn't ready to give up on us. Or maybe I just wasn't ready to be honest, with you or with myself." That was the closest thing to an apology I was going to get. That I nodded slowly, letting her words settle. "I hope she was worth it," I said finally. Jessica looked down at her coffee, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "I don't know." And there it was, the truth. Not wrapped in pretty words or fake regret. Just raw, simple honesty. That I stood up, grabbing my jacket. "Goodbye, Jessica." She didn't stop me. Didn't call after me. That I walked out of that coffee shop feeling lighter, not because she gave me closure, but because I realized I didn't need it from her. Closure isn't something someone gives you. It's something you find when you finally stop waiting for it, and I just found mine. Walking out of that coffee shop, I expected to feel something big, relief, rage, maybe even sadness. But I didn't. I felt nothing. Just the crisp chill of the afternoon air brushing against my face, like the universe was reminding me I was still here. Alive. Breathing. Moving. I'd thought confronting Jessica would give me the closure I needed, but the truth hit me the second my foot hit the pavement outside. I'd already closed that chapter the day I walked out of our house with Duke and never looked back. Seeing her didn't change anything. It didn't erase the betrayal, and it sure as hell didn't fix what was broken. That I stood there for a moment, staring at the world moving around me, people laughing, cars honking, someone playing guitar on the corner like it was just another ordinary day. For them, it was. For me, it was the day I realized I'd been dragging a weight I didn't even know I was carrying. That it wasn't Jessica's betrayal that haunted me. It was the fact that I'd let it define me for so long. That I went back to my apartment, a small space that had started to feel less like a temporary escape and more like a home. Duke greeted me with his usual excitement, tail wagging like I'd been gone for years instead of just an hour. I dropped to my knees, burying my face in his fur, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of nightmares, but because my mind was finally clear, and the silence was deafening. I got out of bed around 2 a.m., grabbed a notebook, and started writing. Not for anyone else, just for me. Words spilled out like they'd been waiting all along. I was enough. I always was. I stared at that sentence, realizing how true it was. Jessica's affair wasn't about me being lacking. It was about her searching for something she couldn't find within herself. That wasn't my burden to carry. The next morning, I did something I'd been avoiding for months. I opened the box of old photos, the ones from our wedding, vacations, birthdays. I looked at them, not with bitterness, but with acceptance. Those moments were real, even if the person in them turned out to be someone I didn't recognize anymore. I kept one photo, a picture of me and Duke at the beach, the sun setting behind us, both of us smiling. That photo wasn't about Jessica. It was about me. About the parts of my life that were still mine, untouched by her choices. I threw the rest away. Not in anger, but with the quiet understanding that they didn't belong in my story anymore. A few weeks later, Mark convinced me to join him on a hiking trip. I was hesitant at first. I wasn't exactly in the mood for nature therapy, but something about the idea of climbing a mountain, of physically pushing myself past limits, felt symbolic. The hike was tough. Steep trails, rocky paths, moments where I wanted to quit. But I kept going, step after step, until we reached the summit. Standing there, looking out over the endless stretch of trees and sky, I felt small, but not in a bad way. Small in the way that reminded me how big the world was, how my pain was just a tiny part of a much larger picture. Mark clapped me on the back. "Feels good, doesn't it?" I nodded, unable to put the feeling into words. It wasn't just the view. It was the climb. The struggle. The fact that I'd made it, even when it hurt. That's when it hit me. Healing isn't about forgetting. It's about moving forward, even when you're still carrying the bruises. When we got back, I framed that photo from the summit. A reminder that I was more than my past. More than the heartbreak that I was still climbing. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of falling. After that hike, something clicked inside me. It wasn't an overnight transformation. Healing doesn't work like that, but it was like I'd found the first brick to start rebuilding. And this time, I wasn't building around someone else's expectations. I was building for me. Back in the apartment, things started to feel different. The same four walls that once felt like a cage now felt like a blank canvas. I decided to make it my own, piece by piece, starting with small changes, painting one of the walls a deep, calming blue, adding shelves filled with books I loved, not the ones Jessica thought were smart enough to display. I even got rid of the couch we'd picked out together. It wasn't about the couch itself, it was about reclaiming my space. I replaced it with a second-hand leather one, worn in all the right places, comfortable in a way that felt lived in, authentic, kind of like me at that point. Duke adapted faster than I did, his tail wagging like he was proud of every small victory I had, hanging a new picture, cooking an actual meal instead of takeout, even laughing at dumb TV shows without feeling guilty for enjoying the quiet. But healing isn't a straight line. One night, I was walking Duke past a familiar street when I saw her. Jessica. She was sitting outside a cafe, laughing with someone I didn't recognize. She looked different, not just on the surface, but in the way she carried herself. I froze for a second, my heart doing that annoying thing where it tried to convince me I still cared, but I didn't, not in the way I thought I would. There was no anger, no longing. Just detachment. Like seeing someone from high school you used to know but realizing you've both grown into entirely different people. I kept walking. When I got home, I expected to feel shaken. But instead, I felt relief. Seeing her living her life, separate from mine, was the final confirmation that I was truly done, not because she'd moved on, but because I had. That night, I pulled out my notebook again, the one where I'd scribbled thoughts during my worst days. I flipped to a blank page and wrote, "I'm not the man she left. I'm the man who stayed. Stayed through the heartbreak. Stayed through the mess. Stayed to face it all, even when it felt unbearable." And now, I was standing. Weeks turned into months. I started going out more, not to escape my thoughts, but to enjoy life again. I reconnected with old friends I'd drifted from during my marriage, realizing how much I'd isolated myself trying to make a relationship work that was doomed long before it ended. One night, I met someone. Her name was Lily. We bumped into each other at a bookstore, both reaching for the same novel. It was cliché, sure, but there was something easy about it. No pressure, no expectations. Just a conversation that turned into coffee, then into long walks and shared stories. She wasn't a replacement for Jessica. She wasn't a fix for my broken heart. She was just Lily, and with her, I realized I didn't have to carry my past like baggage. It was part of me, yes, but it didn't define me anymore. Sitting across from her one evening, laughing over something dumb, I thought, this is what peace feels like. Not perfection. Not a fairy tale, just peace, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Lily wasn't the kind of person who filled silences with empty words. She had this way of sitting in the quiet without making it feel uncomfortable, and I didn't realize how much I needed that until we started spending more time together. There was no pressure to be anyone other than myself, no hidden expectations, no comparisons, no pretending that we started off slow. Coffee dates turned into evening walks, and evening walks turned into late-night talks on park benches, where the only noise was the distant hum of the city and Duke snoring softly at my feet. She'd ask simple questions, not to pry, but because she genuinely wanted to know. One night, we were sitting in my apartment, the lights low, a record playing softly in the background. Duke was curled up in his usual spot, and Lily was flipping through one of my photography books. She glanced up and asked, "What's the photo you're most proud of?" I didn't even have to think about it. I stood up, walked to the shelf, and pulled out the framed photo from my hiking trip, the one Mark and I took at the summit. The sky was a splash of orange and pink, and I was standing there, looking out over the mountains, Duke beside me, both of us small against the vastness of the world that I handed it to her. "This one." She studied it for a moment, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the frame. "It's beautiful. What makes it your favorite?" I sat back down, my heart surprisingly steady. Because that was the first time I realized I was okay. Not perfect. Not fully healed. But okay. She nodded, not filling the space with clichés or forced reassurances. Just nodded, like she understood. And maybe she did. As our relationship grew, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened with Jessica, not out of pain, but out of perspective. I realized how much I'd lost before the affair, even when I thought everything was fine. I'd lost parts of myself trying to hold on to something that wasn't real anymore. Lily never asked about Jessica, not directly. She gave me space to talk if I wanted to, and eventually, I did. One evening, over a bottle of wine and the soft glow of city lights through my window, I told her everything. She listened. Really listened. No interruptions, no pity, just quiet understanding. When I finished, she didn't say, "I'm sorry," like most people did. Instead, she said, "That must have been really hard." And somehow, that felt better than any apology. In the months that followed, life didn't magically become perfect. There were still days when memories crept in, moments when I'd catch myself wondering what if. But they passed quickly, like clouds drifting across a clear sky. One day, while cleaning out my closet, I found an old box tucked in the back, the last remnants of my life with Jessica. Photos, cards, little mementos I'd packed away, thinking I might need them someday. I didn't. I sat on the floor, Duke resting his head on my knee, and went through the box. Not with tears or anger, but with acceptance. Those things were part of my story, but they weren't my story. I kept one thing, a small notebook I used to jot down random thoughts. Flipping through it, I found the page I'd written months ago. "I'm not the man she left. I'm the man who stayed." But I wasn't that man anymore. So I picked up a pen and wrote underneath it, "And now, I'm the man who moved on." Because I had. The box went in the trash. The notebook stayed on my shelf, not as a reminder of the pain, but as proof of how far I'd come. And as I sat there, the quiet wrapping around me like a familiar blanket, I realized something simple and powerful. I'd found myself again, not in spite of the heartbreak, but because of it. After tossing out that box of old memories, it felt like I'd finally crossed some invisible threshold. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden epiphany, no cinematic moment where the clouds parted. Just a quiet sense of lightness, like I'd set down a heavy bag I'd been carrying for so long. I forgot what it felt like to walk without it. Lily and I kept things simple. We didn't rush. There were no grand declarations of love or promises to fix what was broken because, truthfully, I wasn't broken anymore. I was just evolving. Rediscovering parts of myself I'd tucked away during my marriage, thinking they didn't matter. One of those parts was photography. It had always been a hobby, something I dabbled in when life wasn't too busy. But after everything that happened, picking up my camera felt different. It wasn't just about capturing moments, it was about seeing the world through a new lens, literally and metaphorically. I started going on weekend photo walks, just me, Duke, and my camera. Sometimes Lily joined, her curiosity infectious as she'd ask questions about lighting, angles, and why I chose to capture certain things. She never made it about the end result. It was always about the process, the story behind the frame. One day, while editing some photos, she leaned over and said, "You should do a show." I laughed. A show? Like, people standing around judging my pictures while pretending to sip overpriced wine? She grinned. Exactly. But without the pretentiousness. Just, share your work. For you. I brushed it off at first. But the idea lingered. A few weeks later, I found myself at a small local gallery, talking to the owner about a possible exhibit. His enthusiasm surprised me. "Your work has heart," he said. "People connect with that." So I did it. I put together a collection of my favorite photos, landscapes from hikes, candid street shots, even a few portraits of Duke being his goofy self. I titled the exhibit, "Through the Break." Not because it was about heartbreak, but because it was about what came after, the resilience, the quiet beauty in moving forward. The night of the exhibit, the gallery was packed with strangers, friends, even people I hadn't seen in years. Mark showed up, grinning like a proud older brother. Lily was there too, her presence grounding me when my nerves kicked in. As I walked around, overhearing people's reactions to my photos, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Not for surviving heartbreak, but for building something from it. Toward the end of the night, as the crowd thinned, I stood by one particular photo, a black and white shot of a single tree standing alone in an open field, its branches twisted but strong. Lily came up beside me. "That's my favorite." "Mine too," I said quietly. She looked at me, her eyes reflecting the soft gallery lights. "Why?" I thought about it for a moment. "Because it's not about the tree being alone. It's about how it's still standing. No matter what." She smiled, slipping her hand into mine. "Exactly." And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. Really living, not despite the past but because of it, because every scar, every heartbreak, every broken piece had shaped me into someone stronger, someone who could stand tall even after the storm. And that was enough. The gallery closed around midnight, the last of the guests trickling out with soft goodbyes and lingering glances at the photos on the walls. I stood in the middle of the empty space, surrounded by fragments of my journey captured in frames, moments of stillness, light, shadow, and quiet resilience. Lily helped me pack up, her hands gentle, her presence steady. She didn't say much, and she didn't need to. The silence between us wasn't heavy like it used to be when I was with Jessica. This silence was full of understanding, comfort, and a quiet kind of peace I'd never known before. When we got back to my apartment, Duke greeted us like we'd been gone for days, his tail wagging furiously, his joy as simple and pure as ever. I smiled, dropping to the floor to rub his ears, feeling more grounded than I had in years. Later that night, I sat on the balcony alone, a glass of whiskey in hand, the city lights flickering like distant stars. The cool air carried a hint of change, the kind you can't see but feel deep in your bones. I thought about Jessica, not with anger or sadness, but with clarity. She was part of my story, yes, but she wasn't the story. Her betrayal had been a catalyst, a painful shove that forced me to face parts of myself I'd been avoiding. But it wasn't the end. It was the beginning. I pulled out the old notebook I'd kept through it all. The pages were filled with raw, messy thoughts, scribbles from nights when I felt lost, words that had carried me through the worst of it. Flipping to the last page, I wrote, "I am not what was broken. I am what was rebuilt." I closed the notebook, feeling the finality of those words settle into my chest like the last piece of a puzzle snapping into place. Life moved on after that, not with dramatic changes, but with small, meaningful ones. I kept taking photos, kept exploring, kept living. My world grew, not just with new people and places, but with new parts of myself I discovered along the way. Lily and I stayed together, but it was never about filling a void. She wasn't my escape from the past, she was part of the future I'd built for myself. One morning, as the sun poured through the windows, casting golden streaks across the floor, I realized something simple but profound. I was happy, not the fleeting kind of happiness that depends on someone else, but the kind that comes from within, the kind that grows in the space where pain once lived. Looking back, I wouldn't change a thing. Because every heartbreak, every mistake, every moment I thought I couldn't survive had led me here, to a life I created, a life I chose, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't defined by what I'd lost, that I was defined by what I'd found.